Hi, everybody. I know that in the next couple of weeks, we're going to have to be trying some new things to continue to join together as the church. So I thought, in the absence of the Wednesday night small groups that we're used to having, and in the absence of my Sunday night service, I thought, why not try something new? So my plan is to put one of these out every Sunday night, and I thought I would just sit by the fire and tell some of the old stories of the Bible that maybe people aren't as familiar with. And the reason that I chose to do it by the fire is because this is the way that people for thousands and thousands of years pass down the stories of their people. So I thought, what better way to pass down the story of our faith than to sit by a fire, just like people would have done hundreds and thousands of years ago, and share the great stories of our faith. So the one that I want to start with is the story of Esther. And I know a lot of people are probably familiar with the story of Esther to some degree, but I thought it would be really kind of fun to just go through the whole thing. And this isn't necessarily going to be something where I stop and talk about all of the deeper theological meanings of all of the different Bible stories that we go through. I just want to tell the stories so that when Chris preaches on them in service, when we're all able to get back together again in a few more weeks, that anytime he preaches about something like this, that maybe we'll have a little bit more background information about the stories that he preaches on. So for the next couple of weeks, like I said, I'm going to be going through the book of Esther. But the book of Esther really doesn't start in the book of Esther. The book of Esther starts really in Daniel chapter 5. By Daniel chapter 5, the Jews from Jerusalem had been in captivity in Babylon for nearly the entire 70 years that God said that they were going to be removed from their land. One night, King Nebuchadnezzar, who was the king of the empire of Babylon and had conquered Jerusalem and taken the people into slavery, one night his grandson, who was the newly crowned king of Babylon, King Belshazzar, was throwing a very grand banquet. And it says that there were over 1,000 people in attendance, and they were drinking wine and making fools out of themselves. And suddenly Belshazzar had an idea, and he told one of his servants to go and fetch the holy relics of the Jewish people that they had conquered, and to bring them into the party so that they might drink out of them and make a mockery of the Jewish God. So they did, and as soon as they started drinking out of the cups and the holy vessels that came out of the temple of God, a great hand appeared in the middle of the room, and it started to write on the plaster on the wall, and Belshazzar was terrified. The Bible says that his knees gave way and his bowels loosened. And when he came to, his queen asked him why he was so afraid. And he says, "I've seen a great hand that's written on the wall. Go and fetch all of the diviners in the kingdom and bring them here so that somebody might interpret what this writing means." And all of the diviners and magicians in the kingdom were brought to Belshazzar's presence. And none of them could come up with any explanation of what the writing meant. But Belshazzar's queen reminded him, "There's a man that's in your kingdom that's one of the enslaved Jews. And in the reign of your grandfather, Nebuchadnezzar, he was able to interpret the will of the holy God, and he was very valuable to your grandfather." So Belshazzar had his men go and fetch Daniel. And by this point, Daniel was very old and very cranky. So Daniel was summoned into the midst of this great debaucherous party. And Belshazzar offered him a robe of purple and a gold chain for his neck, and even up to a third of his kingdom. And when he offered those things to Daniel, Daniel spat back and he said, "You can keep your kingdom and you can keep your rewards. But I will tell you what the writing says. And before I do, let me tell you a little something about your grandfather. Your grandfather was the greatest man in the history of the earth. And he was great because my God gave him greatness. He killed who he thought needed to be killed, and he brought low who he thought needed to be brought low. And it was all done by the power of my God. And when your grandfather Nebuchadnezzar forgot that, he was struck with madness, and he lived in the desert as a wild animal for 7 years before my God re-granted him his sanity. And he came back and reigned again in the power of my God. You, Belshazzar, disgust me. You're not even half the man your grandfather was. And that's why I will tell you what the writing on the wall says. It says, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. And this is what it means. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you who have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. And Perez, which is the singular form of Parsin. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Little did King Belshazzar know that when Daniel told him that his kingdom was divided and given to the Medes and the Persians, that it would be that very night. You see, the Babylonians thought that their great city was unconquerable because they had altered the flow of the Euphrates River to encircle their walled city so that no boats could come and lay siege to the city because the river wasn't deep enough. And no army could lay siege to the city because the river was too marshy. So they assumed that they would be forever protected by their own wisdom and their own devices. But that very night, the Persian king Cyrus had dammed up the Euphrates River miles upstream. So they were able to walk into the city completely undeterred. So the next morning when Belshazzar and all of his friends and people at his party woke up, they woke up to King Cyrus and the Persian army, telling them that they had been conquered. And the Jewish tradition, the Babylonian Talmud, tells us that as King Cyrus was triumphantly marching down the main street of the city of Babylon, Daniel himself walked up to King Cyrus and said, "I've been waiting for you. My God instructed one of our prophets to write about you 150 years ago." And according to the Babylonian Talmud, Daniel himself handed Cyrus the Great the scroll of Isaiah. And in our Bible, in Isaiah 44, verse 27, it says, "Who says to the deep, be dry? I will dry up your rivers. Who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and he will carry out all of my purpose? And who says of Jerusalem, it shall be rebuilt, and of the temple your foundation shall be laid?" You can imagine the reaction that Cyrus had when Daniel showed him a 150-year-old scroll that told him exactly how he was going to conquer the greatest empire the world had ever seen. Now we fast forward a couple of decades. And Cyrus the Great is no longer the king, but a man is ruling in his place after his death, a king named Ahasuerus. And just like King Belshazzar before him, King Ahasuerus, the Persian king, was throwing a very grand banquet. He was having a party that was to last 180 days. And on the seventh day of the party, the Bible says, in the seventh day of his drunkenness, he wanted to parade his newest won queen out for all of his comrades to see. Her name was Queen Vashti, and she had world-renowned beauty, and she came from the newly conquered lands in India. Well, when word was sent to Queen Vashti that the king required her presence so that he might show her off to everyone at his party, she refused to come. And this caused a great uproar in the kingdom. But she still refused to come. So the king's advisors told him, "King, it is not befitting of you to have a queen that doesn't answer your commands." So Queen Vashti was banned from the royal court. So one purpose had been served. Queen Vashti had been punished, and she had been removed. But this leaves the king without his trophy wife. So what's the king to do? Well, he decides that over the course of this 180-day party, he is going to have all of the beautiful women of the kingdom, all of the young virgins brought before him, and he's going to pick himself a new trophy queen. So he brings the women in one at a time. He entertains them for an evening. They enter his chambers as a young virgin, and they leave his chambers the next day as part of his stable of concubines. There was a certain man that was part of the Jewish exile named Mordecai, who was living in the immediate area of King Ahasuerus' palace. And this man Mordecai had raised one of his nieces from birth. Her name was Esther. Esther was chosen to be one of the women that entertained the king for an evening. But immediately when he laid his eyes on her, he was very taken with Esther. So he didn't treat her the way that he treated every other woman that had come to his palace. So he immediately made Esther one of his queens. And she was brought into his trust. Well, very shortly after this happened, Esther's uncle Mordecai learned of a plot that was afoot to assassinate the king. So he went and told his niece, the newly crowned queen, and said, "You need to warn the king that there are men that have planned to assassinate him. But don't tell him who you are or who your people are." So heeding the advice of her uncle, Esther went to her new husband and told him of the plot to kill him. And to his credit, he listened. And within a matter of days, all of the conspirators had been found out and publicly hanged. After these conspirators had been found out and hung, there was a vacancy in the king's cabinet. So a man named Haman was elevated to the position of the number 2 in all of the empire of the Persians. And when people were told to bow down and worship Haman, everyone did except for one man, Mordecai. Mordecai refused to bow. Haman was infuriated. He wanted to have Mordecai killed on the spot, but he thought it was beneath him to lay hands on him. So he devised a plan. And he went to the king and he cast lots. His plan was to eradicate the entirety of the Jewish population. And he was so sure of this plan that when he cast lots, he didn't cast lots to see whether or not he should bring this plan to the king, because he was sure the king would allow it. He cast lots only to find out what day he should carry out his act. Now, it's interesting that it's Mordecai's God who set the events in place to bring Haman to power. But it's also Mordecai's God who effected the casting of the lots that Haman did. Haman's lots told him that in 1 year's time, the Holocaust of the Jews would take place. Haman went to his king and he said, "There's a certain people that are scattered all throughout your kingdom. And they keep their own laws. They don't follow our laws. They don't worship our gods. And it's in the king's best interest that these people be destroyed." So the king agreed. Haman's devious plot was approved. And with that, word went out to the entire empire that in 1 year's time, every Jew would be exterminated. And that is the end of tonight's story of Esther. Next week, we will find out what Esther's response is. So I hope to see you then.